Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. We're recording this on a Friday morning where markets are already in turmoil following Donald Trump's announcing yesterday of tariffs and, just about everywhere on the planet. Is it Trumpageddon, we want to ask today? We're going to explain what tariffs are and what the consequences are economically, not only for the United States, but for the EU and indeed other countries around the world. At Holyrood, Jamie Green has resigned the Conservative Party whip, and Patrick Harvey is stepping down as co-leader of the Scottish Greens. We'll run the rule over those issues. But good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Bernard.
Let's start with the Trump tariffs.
And yes, there's a joyous thing to start with, isn't it? That brings up.
Let's all depress people. Before we get into some of the economic ramifications of the course of the American president, just sort of do, for people like me who would not claim to be economists, an idiot's guide on tariffs.
Well, I wouldn't claim to be an economist either. We're starting from a very poor position here. So this will be a bluffer's guide to tariffs, I suppose. Okay, so Trump has announced tariffs on every country in the world, effectively, except for North Korea, which doesn't export an awful lot to the United States. The UK is having a 10% tariff, the EU 20%. These tariffs go up to 46% for countries such as Vietnam, which is a heavily export-dependent economy that exports a lot to the United States. Tariffs on China are now, I think, around 54% because there was a 20% tariff on China that's now been added to. 25% or so on India. What this means, essentially, and the way a tariff works, and I feel that we ought to actually have Donald Trump on the show here so that we can explain how tariffs work to him, because one of the things that is quite clear is that Donald Trump, who has a very 19th century view of the world, doesn't actually understand how tariffs work. He views tariffs as basically checks written by companies overseas and by foreign countries to the United States government, and therefore income from tariffs can substitute for income tax within the United States, which he plans to cut. This is not how tariffs work. Suppose you are an exporter or a company in the United Kingdom selling whisky or widgets or whatever to the United States, and you sell £100 of widgets. The cost of those widgets now in the United States will be £110. If you were selling from the European Union, the cost would be 120. That money is normally paid by the importer of the widget, not by the exporter. The consequence of this, however, is that in the UK case, £10 of value is going missing. In the EU case, £20 of value is going missing. In a Vietnamese case, £46 of value is going missing because you have these additional costs. Somebody has to take a haircut here. So the exporter can agree to accept a lower margin on their product. The importer can also accept a lower margin if they are then going to be reselling the widgets. Either way, however, somebody is, a certain amount of money is being lost. And for exporters, their products become more expensive in the United States. And that is the case whether you are exporting flat screen televisions from China or you are exporting components for fighter jets from the UK to the United States, because around 15% of every F-35 fighter jet is actually made in the United Kingdom. So the Americans are making their own fighter planes more expensive to themselves. So the exporters' products become more expensive and therefore less competitive. But prices increase for domestic consumers in the United States as well. And you then have in a tariff war, if you have tit-for-tat tariffs, whereby Canada or Mexico or the European Union or the UK impose retaliatory tariffs on products from the United States, then consumers in the UK or those countries will also lose out. So it becomes a lose-lose proposition. and that is why, markets have fallen all around the world, but most particularly in the United States, because prices will go up, and that will cause inflationary pressures on the United States economy. And it is still the case that if the US economy catches a cold, then so do economies all around the world. And so, the whole thing is disastrous. It is unraveling 80 years of trade orthodoxy.
Well, let's just tease out one or two of the issues, because since this was all announced yesterday, and we can discuss what markets being in turmoil actually means. Just as a consequence of the announcement yesterday, I'm just looking at a news feed this morning, 8:27 a.m. The news flashes that the FTSE 100 is on track for its worst week in nearly 2 years. 7:48 a.m., traders in the city are betting that the Bank of England will cut rates 3 times this year. This is clearly because there are fears of a recession which in part will have been made by these announcements. 7:38 a.m., the Foreign Secretary David Lammy criticises Trump's return to protectionism. 7:36 a.m., the IMF boss warns Trump's tariffs pose, quote, a significant risk to the world economy. Excuse me, and not to be outdone, the man himself, 7:19 a.m., Trump claims that Starmer is very happy with the tariffs.
Yes.
You speak a little more, but like cough.
Yeah, bless you, bud, bless you. Well, I mean, that's a perfectly rational response. I think you're coughing there to what the Americans are up to. I mean, the other thing I think that it really can't be stressed too strongly that the way in which the American administration has calculated these tariffs around the world is absolutely moronic. Because essentially they have taken a view. Trump's view is that every country with which the United States has a trade deficit, i.e., in which the US imports more from them than they export to those countries, that essentially the tariff should be half the value of that trade deficit. So this leads to extraordinary situations where, for instance, the Falkland Islands, which is not a major economy, but do export sort of shellfish and other, fish and so on, perhaps penguins as well, I don't know, to the United States, now has a 40% tariff on exports to the United States. Trump takes the view that trade deficits are a form of sort of stealing from the United States, which is just not true. So you have this, as I say, this bizarre situation where, uninhabited islands in the South Pacific now have tariffs for the United States.
A couple of things
none of it makes sense.
Yeah, a couple of things that sort of strike me as slightly odd. I mean, I was sort of flicking through some right-wing publications, and of course, free markets and free trade is all for people on the political right. But although they've not exactly approved of the tariffs which have been announced, the criticism is somewhat muted on sections of the right because, of course, they sign up to some of his wider political agenda. So they've sort of gone easy on him. In the specific UK context, of course, what we're faced with is tariffs at 10%, but I don't think that will apply to the importing of cars, where the tariff is 25%. At 10%, it raises a question: has the softly diplomatic approach that the Starmer government have taken vis-a-vis Trump actually paid dividends, or is the 10% merely a reflection of the fact that when you divvy up in terms of the balance sheet, imports and exports, that the relationship between the UK and the US is more in balance, in terms of there is not a large and substantial gap in terms of the trade that takes place. No doubt government ministers will claim that it's because the diplomacy which the UK government has used in relation to Trump is bearing fruit. There's also perhaps the more substantive point that if they're going to get a trade deal with the United States, they have to think carefully about retaliatory measures, which may well jeopardize that. But the other extraordinary thing is that we could get to a situation where Trump imposes these tariffs in order to play to that domestic agenda, make America great again. We have to be seen to be doing more for working class people in manufacturing towns in the United States. But they will actually have the opposite effect. And in fact, most of his economic advisors during the presidential campaign were warning him that if you go ahead with this, it's going to be incredibly inflationary. Because it's inflationary, it may well mean that interest rates are going to have to rise. And the very people for whom high inflation and high interest rates are not good news are the very people that you're trying to protect with this kind of economic protectionism. Now, we'll see how these actually bed down. But if they bed down in a way which puts further pressure on hard-pressed workers in the United States, he'll simply rip it up. And because in the land in which he percolates, he'll simply say, well, they've done their job, they're no longer needed, we'll scrap them. The astonishing thing was that when he had that board in the garden of the White House yesterday, going down the list of tariffs as they applied to different countries, he sounded as if he was going through his list of favorite pop songs. This is just lovely. Look at that. It's just all lovely. And you think this is
beautiful Lesotho.
Yes, this is a
80% tariff.
This is a complete and utter nut job. So do not rule out that if in a year's time there is significant evidence that it is impacting in a disadvantageous way on an American workers, that you'll simply tear them up and start again, because that's in the nature of his emotional psyche. But of course, here there is the danger that it could tip the UK economy into recession, which is probably why the Bank of England, who were probably looking at two small adjustments down the way to interest rates between now and the end of the year, as has been suggested in this news flash earlier this morning, may well have to be more interventionist. The consequence of this, not just for the UK economy, but the world economy, is pretty huge. It appears to be just one of the most wanton acts of economic self-harm that we've seen in decades.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to pick up on there, Bernard. I mean, first of all, when you talk about, the British right and so on, you're absolutely correct that, people like Nigel Farage and so on, ordinarily, at least paying lip service to the notions of free traders, suspiciously quiet. People like Dan Hannan, the Tory peer and former MEP and leading light of the Brexit movement, and so I mean, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh at this, Bernard. Hannan deploring Trump, saying this is a ruinous and unbelievably stupid set of decisions that Trump has made, and so on. And yet, this is the same Dan Hannan who just 2 months ago was writing in the Washington Examiner and so on. Look, something strange is happening. Britain is beginning to love Donald Trump, and suggesting that that Trump was plainly a preferable choice as president of the United States than Kamala Harris. There's a lot of history being rewritten here, or a lot of history rather being sort of put into the memory hole, and we'll pretend that it never happened. It'll be interesting to see what Boris Johnson has to say about all of this in his column in the Mail this weekend and so on, because Johnson too has been a sort of fairly shameless when it comes to Trump. I mean, you suggest that Trump may just sort of walk back from some of this stuff. I mean, that's possible because negotiations are always viable with him. But this is something, tariffs is something that he really does believe in, and he has done for his entire life. In the 1980s, Trump was of the view that imports of cars and stereos and so on from Japan were stealing America's future. Japan, then China, now the rest of the world as well. So he's been very consistent on this, and the people around him. I mean, his sort of main trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is even more committed to this sort of tariff agenda than the president is. And there's a view amongst the MAGA right now that you see emerging that if Americans want cheap consumer goods, well, that's not what the American dream is all about. You don't need that new iPad made in China. You don't need this, that, or the next thing, and so on. So suck it up, and suck it up for the Donald. It appears to be the attitude. But within it all, there are some interesting exceptions. There's a carve out, for instance, on pharmaceuticals. Which is something that's been welcomed in the Republic of Ireland, for instance, which is a big pharmaceutical sector, but also in the UK. I mean, companies like AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, Wellcome sell around £6 billion of drugs and medicines to the United States each year. Those have been exempted from the tariffs because even Trump's people, I think, understand that American consumers are not going to be happy if the price of medicines goes up in the United States. Obviously, within a Scottish context, I suppose the main thing is whiskey exports. The US is £1 billion market for Scotch whiskey, and the last time there were tariffs of admittedly rather higher ones of 25%. Then whiskey sales to the US declined significantly, and so that is a concern. The question you asked actually about has the UK done quite well out of this with getting a 10% tariff rather than 20%, which is for the European Union? I think that's 10% is the minimum that is levied on anyone. So the UK is at the lower end of the tariff scale. Whether that reflects the government doing a good job, well, yes and no. We've had an extraordinarily tedious relitigation of Brexit accompanying all of this, with prominent Brexiteers saying that this shows the Brexit bonus and so on. Well, yeah, okay, 10% tariff is better than a 20% tariff, but when you take into account the impact of trade barriers caused by Brexit, then it all becomes much of a muchness. And indeed, the barriers caused by Brexit are probably more damaging to the UK economy than these Trump tariffs will be. But for the love of God, can we put Brexit back in a box and bury it?
Absolutely. Maybe the markets, the kind of volatility that we've seen in markets this morning and yesterday is actually not all that unusual. I mean, markets bounce around all the time, and markets have a way of baking in these proposals and then adjusting accordingly. So it would not surprise me at all if the falls in some share prices that we are seeing had recovered and recover in a fairly short period of time. Markets react to these kind of events, and if they get jittery, then you tend to get a run on prices. But they do tend to correct themselves, and they do tend to correct themselves fairly quickly. I mean, we can remember what happened with the disastrous Truss budget and the reaction of the markets there. If, however, this ushers in a sort of worldwide trade war, and it becomes a spiral in which people are reacting, and he then imposes more tariffs, and then there's this vicious cycle, and there is a serious run on markets. It is actually pretty important. We know what the consequences could be for the macroeconomy. We know that one of the consequences of these kind of trade wars is that inflation could go up. We know that in certain sectors, unemployment could go up as certain sectors become uncompetitive. But there are other consequences too. I mean, we have in the UK a system now of auto-enrollment for every worker. This was the idea that we can't have any worker in workplaces who are not contributing to some sort of pension. Now, the way in which these systems work, defined contribution systems, is that something comes off your salary, it's then put into a pot, it's then passively managed in the sense that the individual worker doesn't decide where that pot of money is actually invested, but you just simply turn it over to somebody to invest on your behalf. Now, workers, quite right, they will not know whether monthly contributions are being invested. But if there is continual turbulence in stock markets, and across the board, stocks are falling, and some stocks are aggressively falling, that will work its way through into the individual pension accounts of individual workers, and indeed for people coming up to retirement who are perhaps looking at a DC pot to have an income drawdown, which is where most people now no longer buy annuities, they go for income drawdown. If you start to retire in the context of aggressive turbulence in markets with no end in sight, that materially affects your retirement. So there are consequences of this at the macroeconomic level, which governments and central banks have to deal with, but this percolates all the way down to have an effect in the pounds, shillings, and pence of ordinary folk.
Absolutely. The United States is still the world leader. It's still the world's most important country. And Trump talks about this as being a mission to reindustrialize the United States. And it is true that the US share of global manufacturing has decreased significantly this century. However, the US, which is around 4-5% of global population, is still, I think it's around 17% of global manufacturing comes from the United States. And that's before you could start thinking about services, cultural stuff, and all the rest of it. The United States is still the world's most important economy. And, but Trump is essentially betting that Adam Smith is wrong. And I mean, I know that intellectually it's hard to, it's not a fair fight, is it, between Donald Trump and Adam Smith? But I mean, the trouble is that there is no arguing with Trump on this because he doesn't actually understand his own policy. He doesn't understand how tariffs work. He doesn't one of the complaints that the Americans have is that American exports to the UK and the European Union are charged VAT, and they think of VAT as a barrier to trade. But domestic manufacturing is also charged VAT, so there is no unfairness there. And the weighted average of EU tariffs on US exports is around 3%, and it's pretty similar in the UK too. That is a very low tariff by historic standards. It's not completely free trade, but it's getting towards free trade. And the further irony of it is that if you look at the last 10 years or so, then, sure, there was a big inflationary spike in the United States, as there were in lots of other countries after COVID. And some of that, not all of it, but some of that could be attributed to Joe Biden's expansionary fiscal policies and so on. But the US economy has actually done extremely well in the last decade. So Trump's actions are poisoning a success domestically while inflicting enormous hurt and difficulty overseas. And there's a further consideration, I think, particularly when you look at geopolitics, because trade and foreign policy and security policy are all actually interlinked. And if you have a situation where countries such as South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and India are all being punished by the United States, then unavoidably those countries are effectively pushed closer to China than would otherwise have been the case. And the same in Africa and elsewhere, where a US retreat is an invitation to China to expand its influence, both in terms of hard power and soft power. And so, since China is viewed as the United States' great competitor for the rest of this century, then taking actions which weaken the US and its friends, as such, we must still consider the United Kingdom and the European Union, at the expense of strengthening China and its friends, is an utterly moronic and counterproductive approach to take. And yet this is where we are with this administration in Washington. It is boneheaded economically, it is boneheaded in politically, and it is boneheaded strategically.
I think you're right.
It's all going very well.
I think you're right in saying that. I mean, he's coming at this not from economics. This is a political state of mind that he's pursuing here. You were sort of name checking Daniel Hannan. I'm just again flicking through my news feed, and David Frost.
Oh God!
Not hello, good evening, and welcome, but Lord Frost, the great Brexiteer himself. I mean, again, if you want to, and as an example of the schizophrenia on the right that percolates around this, the headline in the article from David Frost: "There's method to Trump's madness. Political considerations are just as important as the drive for economic gain." And then in his very first paragraph, He says, we're all free market purists now. Today's airwaves are full of people reminding us that David Ricardo was right and that President Trump's tariffs will boost inflation, increase costs, and hit global growth. Obviously, I agree, he says. So on the one hand, he's taking a fairly rational view about this, but he can't break himself away from the overall politics of this, which is to give the president a fairly easy ride politically, because there are other parts of the agenda that he agrees with.
Yeah.
When it comes to kind of restrictive stuff, in the past, this wasn't the kind of stuff that the political right used to come out with. The idea of a siege economy mentality and massive import controls was the very bedrock of Labour's economic prospectus in the early 1980s. So,
and how did that go?
Yes.
Lord Frost, of course, is also former head of the Scotch Whisky Association.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe let's talking of schizophrenia on the right there, but perhaps we should move on and move back.
Yes.
Back to Scotland and so on. Jamie Green. I suppose the wettest Tory in Holyrood is no longer a Tory, and is therefore perhaps the driest independent in the Holyrood Parliament. Talk us through what's been going on there. Who is Jamie Green? Does his resignation from the Conservative Party matter? What does it mean for Russell Findlay, etc., etc., etc.? We haven't talked about the Tories for a while, so let's have a bit of sport kicking them around.
Yes. Let's first of all say that this is an example of some people may well know who Jamie Green is. If he's an MSP in your region, you've probably heard of him. If you have a passing interest in politics, you may well have seen him on the telly at some stage. Not a household name, and I suspect that for most voters there will be a shrug of the shoulders and they'll say, Jamie who? But this is something which, let me tell you, and I don't attend Holyrood now because I'm superannuated.
And you have a life, Bernard. You have a life.
I have a life. But some of that life also depends on sort of talking quite a lot to serving politicians. And I have to tell you that within Holyrood, this came as absolutely no surprise whatsoever. The only question that was going to emerge was, when was he going to do it? Why did he join the Tory party? Well, he comes from Ayrshire. He comes from, I think he comes from Greenock. He represents the west of Scotland. Working class background, gay man, someone who was attracted by what he refers to as the social liberalism of David Cameron's Conservative Party. Now, at that particular time, there were people like Jamie Green who did join the Conservative Party. And I can remember covering Conservative conferences for very, very many years. And Conservative conferences, there was the Blue Rinse Brigade, often the subject of much satire. Many of these women were socially conservative. And even during, the New Labour years, when there was a lot of liberal legislation before the House of Commons on lowering the age of consent, equalising the age of consent for gay relationships, a majority of Conservative MPs at this time were still in the socially conservative lobby. Long after the debate about hanging was a settled debate in public policy terms, you could still find lots of people within the Conservative Party who wanted a return to capital punishment. Now, there was a sense in which one of the consequences of the New Labour years was that Osborne and Cameron said, look, we have to get real about the nature of the society in which we live. And they embraced, in that sense, the socially liberal agenda. In Scotland, it was, I think, personified by the career of Ruth Davidson. And I was very, very conscious that in the run-up to 2010 and after 2010, people were joining the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. And I would have thought these people are not archetypal conservatives. And I think the issue is that a number of them were young and were socially liberal. But I always thought to myself, do they really understand what being a conservative is in economic terms? Do they get the full extent of the philosophical base of conservatism? I was never convinced that they were. In fact, even with someone like Russell Finlay, I mean, Russell is, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, he's a Johnny-come-lately to politics who has certain views, particularly around law and order. I'm not at all convinced that he has terribly many anchors in philosophical positions within the political right. And so, in that sense, I would pose the question, is Jamie Green a conservative at all, or is his natural political home really not the Liberal Democrats? And indeed, if he wants to continue a political career, he now has two choices. He either stands again in 2026 as an independent, and I would suggest he has absolutely no chance, or in the coming weeks, he jumps ship within Holyrood and joins another party.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie. I mean, you're right that it's no great surprise. I think that Jamie Green has resigned the Conservative whip and left the Conservative Party. He's been unhappy with the party for many years under successive leaders. It's not just Russell Finlay. He was extremely unhappy with Douglas Ross and his leadership. Yeah, I think there's also a degree of the writing was on the wall for him. I suspect that the talk at Holyrood was that Jamie Green might be fourth or even fifth on the West of Scotland list for the Conservatives at next year's election, and that would have been a termination of his career in that sense as well. Of course, he was eased out of his position as a front bench spokesman. He a couple of years ago he has always suggested that was because he backed Nicola Sturgeon's gender recognition reforms. He was one of only 3 Conservative MSPs to do so. Whether that's the case or not, there was clearly a poor fit, if you like, between him and the leadership. But one of the interesting things for the Conservative Party at the moment is that on the one hand, you have Jamie Green leaving the party because the Conservatives are, as he complains, kissing up to the reform, if you like, chasing reform voters. And Jamie Green suggests that this is both disastrous for the party in political terms, but also, in a sense, morally reprehensible. At the same time, of course, you have various councillors around Scotland who are leaving the Conservative Party to join Reform. So on the one hand, you have Jamie Green on the wet wing of the party saying, the party is far too right wing. And then on the other, you have a number of councillors around Scotland saying that the Conservative Party isn't nearly right wing enough. And so they're off to join Reform. So where do you think this leaves Russell Finlay? And is there anything he can do about it?
Yesterday he was, I think, giving some interviews in the Garden Lobby, and I think his line was, "Well, you can't satisfy all of the people all of the time."
Well, that's very true, isn't it?
That was the line, and I thought, well, how original. Where does it leave them? To a certain extent, and I think this is where Russell Finlay and Kemi Badenoch are actually in the same territory. And that territory is called no man's land. I don't necessarily buy the Jamie Green analysis. I don't see that they've moved to the right at all. I just think that they're inhabiting an ideological no man's land. Many, many months ago, and in the aftermath of the general election, we discussed a lot about what does the Conservative Party do to the threat of Reform UK. Now, that's a question which is not only pertinent for Kemi Badenoch, it's pertinent for Russell Finlay as well. And the answer is that the Tories still have not decided what they do about this. A number of them saying you cannot possibly move to the right. Farage has made it perfectly clear that under no circumstances will he deal with the Tories. There's no question that there could be electoral pacts at Westminster to try and remove Labour, because he senses that he can take more of their voters and get them on side. Farage is also in that dream place in politics. He doesn't have to spell out a policy. He doesn't have to spell out a vision. He simply has to be a sponge for all kinds of political discontent. And given where they are in the polls, you could walk down Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow today and you could stop people and they would say that they're going to vote for Reform UK. And if you ask them why they're going to vote for Reform UK, I suggest that you will get the word immigration. And then if you ask a supplementary question, what do you stand for? You will get a vacant stare. And in a sense that one of the strengths of Farage is that he has this lightning rod of immigration in which people will coalesce around, but he doesn't have to spell anything out. But the fact is that he's taking votes from both Labour and the Conservatives, and the Tories in particular simply have no answer to this. One of the things which is becoming abundantly clear is that there is no coherent narrative, either at the level of the Westminster Parliament or the Scottish Parliament, because Kemi Badenoch simply has no sense of strategic direction, no compelling narrative about how you get people of the centre right behind you and stop them from going to Farage. And because Russell Finlay has a lack of philosophical anchors too, I simply don't think he has it within him to come up with a coherent strategy about how the Scottish Tories deal with this. So both the Scottish leader and the UK leader are happily doing a dance in no man's land, and they will pay the price for their lack of thinking.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right to point out the asymmetric aspect of this. Reform do very well, I think, in Scotland at the moment, precisely, and indeed at a UK level, precisely because they don't have policies. Very stupid for Reform to introduce a detailed slate of policies in advance of Holyrood next year and so on, because that will give people reasons not to vote for them. Whereas at the moment, they serve as a sort of catch-all for discontent and the scunnered vote, and that is much more effective for them. So, I would say to Reform people in Scotland, do not bother coming up with a slate of policies, most of which will be mad anyway. The lack of policy is key to your future success. But we've got one more thing to talk about, haven't we, Bernard? So, Patrick Harvey, moving on. Patrick Harvey is stepping down as co-leader of the Greens after 17 years in post, during which time the Greens have significantly increased their representation at Holyrood, carved out a clear niche for themselves on the left of Scottish politics, and of course, for a couple of years, entered government. Which was a remarkable achievement, I think one would have to acknowledge for the Green Party. Whether it was a success, whether they were a success in government is neither here nor there, perhaps, in this respect. Viewed on that, what's your view on the sort of significance of Patrick Harvey, his achievements, his record as a politician, what it will mean for the Green Party henceforth now that he is no longer stewarding it?
Well, I think that you actually ticked all the boxes in terms of what you would point out to as being a pretty solid record. I mean, I can remember again in before they were called the Green Party, it was the Ecology Party, and they used to fight parliamentary by-elections in Scotland. And I can remember at the early days of the Scottish Green Party, when again they would stand in by-elections and get absolutely nowhere. I can remember
happy days, Bernard. A simpler, better time.
I can remember the Greens in the Scottish Constitutional Convention, for example. They actually walked from the convention fairly early doors. Nobody batted an eyelid, and not many people can remember that because they didn't play a particularly large part in the political scene. But of course, the electoral system at Holyrood, in a sense, delivered for them. I mean, I think you can't overstate the importance of the electoral system in terms of the growth of the Greens. But the sort of cuddly image, without again in the early days people knowing what they stood for, what they did fairly effectively was to marry an environmental agenda with what you could have called a broader political agenda. You're absolutely right to say. I mean, the Greens are not just environmentalists full stop. They're a party of the left. They're a party very, very comfortably on the left. They embraced issues in relation to a human rights agenda, and of course, in the Scottish context, on trans rights and so on, which gives them a distinct identity. And whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he has been a fairly articulate advocate for that kind of politics. I suppose that the legacy is that you couldn't imagine the Scottish Parliament without a significant number of Green voices within it. And if you look at people, for example, like Ross Greer, who's a pretty articulate young guy, and I think will
The Bears Den
certainly
Che
be
Guevara.
yes, yes, yes. He's an articulate young guy. Now, had he been born 30 years earlier, he wouldn't have been a Green because they wouldn't have been around. The fact is that they do attract votes from a number of younger people who do not relate to the traditional political tribes. And of course, the Greens are also pro independence. So take pro independence, tick, redistribution of wealth, tick, trans rights, tick, aggressive human rights, tick. You start to put together something which is far broader than no economic growth, everything seen through the prism of the environment. They're a very, very loose coalition of interests, but I think one which also, in terms of government, it is culturally absolutely not suited to being in government at all. The Greens are at their best when they're perpetual oppositionists.
Well, there are certainly people in the SNP who would agree with that analysis, who take the view that the Green influence on the government was fairly disastrous. The suggestion that every home would have to have a heat pump regardless of cost, the suggestion, although it was only in a consultation, of banning wood burning stoves in new builds, of closing significant portions of the sea to all human activity in highly protected marine areas. Lots of these things never happened. They were introduced by or suggested by the Green Party in government, and part of an agenda which at times in Nicola Sturgeon's later years and Hamza Yousaf's baleful year in office, there were times when you would look at the Scottish government and you would think, well, hang on a minute, on across significant areas of responsibility and so on, who is driving this bus? Is it the SNP or is it the Greens? And I think from a political point of view, regardless of whether you happen to agree with the Green agenda or not, and I happen to think that most of their policies are absolutely ruinous. Nevertheless, from a political point of view, they had significant achievements that they could point to. And the party is very urban, very young, very much a party for people renting their homes rather than people with mortgages or people who own their homes outright, which explains the Green Party's enthusiasm for rent controls, which will be counterproductive as they always are. But never mind, one can see why they are appealing to people. There is a certain consistency of the Green worldview that does make sense if judged on its own merits. And Patrick Harvey has been, as you say, an articulate spokesman for that. Who do you
I
think
think
is
that there's
most likely
also
to replace him, though? I mean, I suspect Ross Greer is most likely to, because he's the most
yeah.
sort of presentable and best on camera. But I admit I'm not hugely plugged into Green circles.
That would be a sensible choice.
Well, let's hope they do something idiotic then.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that also, for a party with a sort of cuddly image, I think that there are real streaks of intolerance there as well. I mean, one of the first MSPs to be elected was Robin Harper. Now, Robin Harper has effectively disowned the Scottish Greens, and he said that he does not recognise the party that he joined. One of the most articulate MSPs in the last Parliament was Andy Whiteman, completely and utterly disowned because of his views on the trans issue. So there is a sense in which this is an ostensibly a left of centre liberal in the sense of human rights. But if you do not toe the line, on certain issues, it becomes not a very welcoming place. And that would certainly, I think, be Andy Whiteman's view, and it would certainly be Robin Harper's view.
Yes, I mean, I take the view that the Green Party is a party of and for prigs, and holy willies. But there was a very interesting thing done by the Scottish Election Monitor, regular survey of public opinion, where they asked supporters of every party to place themselves on an ideological spectrum, where 1 was very, very, very left wing, and 10 was extraordinarily right wing. And it's a useful exercise because it shows where people think they are on the spectrum. Now, Reform voters generally gave themselves a 7 out of 10. So, on the right, definitely. But Reform voters don't view themselves as being, sort of hardcore super fascist right. Then you have the Conservatives a little bit more towards the centre, Liberal Democrats and Labour in the centre, the SNP largely in the centre too. And then you have over on the left, the Greens. And Green supporters gave themselves an average score of 2. So extremely left-wing, more left-wing in their view than Reform voters are right-wing in their view, which I think is a very interesting finding because it does suggest that there is an extremist party in Scotland, and it isn't Reform, it's the Greens.
Well, I shall leave you with one little anecdote. The Scottish Green candidate in the Govan by-election
The famous Govan by-election
was a lovely guy called George Campbell, and I would suggest that George Campbell is probably way out of kilter with what you find in the Scottish Greens nowadays. But I remember him telling me that when he was canvassing certain areas of the constituency which would be regarded as staunch, if you get my drift. And he was told by an elector, "There's no way I'm voting for a Green." To which George said to the voter, "Even the grass at Ibrox is green." I think on that note, we'll wrap this edition up. Good chatting this morning. Interesting to see how all this tariff stuff will play over the coming weeks. We will no doubt return to it. But for me, for the moment, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me with the reminder that things can always get worse.